Are any of you familiar with the phrase power trip? Do you know anyone that's taken one of those trips? Have you taken one yourself? Because I've taken some really nice, write a postcard home kind of power trips. When I got my first official adult job out of college, I filled out the application and I said I was looking for a position that offered management experience with opportunities for advancement, by which I meant I wanted something with power and money. And so I went after it, and I went after it with a vengeance. And one of the very clear memories in my mind now that what I was on was a power trip was I have this very clear memory of sitting across a desk from my boss. There was this new position that opened that I really wanted, and my boss was trying to decide between me and one of my coworkers. And I have this very clear memory of sitting across from his desk, telling him all the ways in which I was better than my coworker for this position, while she was sitting right beside me. It was ugly. It was a power trip. And somewhere along the way, thank God, God kept planting this question in the back of my mind, and it went something like, as great and as nice as power and money are, rich will your life really be full if you get that? And that question kept haunting me. The more I pursued it, the more I got this sense that even when I found it, it wasn't going to be this full kind of life I was looking for. And I honestly believe that part of God calling me into vocational ministry was so that every single day I would have to be faced with some sort of coming encounter with the Jesus that calls us onto a trip that's very different than a power trip. Because otherwise, I'd be right back on the road, headed down to wherever power trip leads you. Today, we are going to be looking again at the story of Joseph, not the dad of Jesus, but this Joseph from the book of Genesis. And we're going to follow him through a power trip that he took. And by the time we get to the end, I'm going to try to convince you that God, in fact, wants us all individually and as a community to take a power trip. But it's going to look different than what the typical power trip looks like. In fact, it's going to look a little bit like a reverse power trip. If you've been following the story of Joseph, Julie brought us up to the place last week where he had been sold into slavery and he had been thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. While he's in prison, he's in Egypt. He got sold into slavery. He was living in Israel with his family, got sold into slavery. He's transported to Egypt, so now he's in an Egyptian prison. While he's there, he meets an official of Pharaoh. This official is a cupbearer. So this was a role where whenever Pharaoh was going to drink something, the cupbearer would bring the cup to Pharaoh, and part of the job also was tasting what was in the cup beforehand to make sure it wasn't poison. So close to power, but also you could die. So this is the job of the cupbearer. And something the cupbearer had done got Pharaoh upset with him, and the cupbearer gets thrown into prison, which is where Joseph meets him. And while they're in prison together, the cupbearer has a dream. And Joseph, we find, has this gift from God to be able to interpret dreams and explain them as visions of the future. And the cupbearer is talking about his dream with Joseph, and Joseph said, this dream is a vision of the future, and what it means is that, cupbearer, you are going to be restored to the good graces of Pharaoh. And sure enough, it happens. And so Joseph, he does this good thing, but he's sitting in prison, and he stays in prison for another 2 years. He becomes a model prisoner, and 2 years down the road, Pharaoh has a couple really disturbing dreams. And he doesn't know what they mean, and he asks his court officials, and no one can tell him what these dreams mean. And the cupbearer remembers, hey, I met a guy in prison who told me what my dreams mean. Maybe he could tell you, Pharaoh, what your dream means. So they get Joseph out of prison, they clean him up, they take him to Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells his dreams to Joseph, and Joseph says, yes, I know what they mean. This is a vision from God of the future. And this vision that God's giving you, Joseph says, is that Egypt is about to have 7 really good agriculturally productive years. And then there are going to be 7 years of famine. So this is what Joseph tells Pharaoh is the interpretation of his dream. And then Joseph has some advice for Pharaoh that we find in Genesis chapter 41, verse 33. Joseph says, "Now therefore, that you know what's coming, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine." The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And so Joseph takes over and takes command of the agricultural production of Egypt. And he starts putting into this plan where when they do the harvest, they're going to save part of it. And they do this for 7 years, and these 7 great years of agricultural productivity. And then the rain dries up, and the crops wither, and famine comes. But when that happens, they've stored up all of this grain and this food in Egypt, and they're not only able to feed their own people, but as the famine and the drought spread to the surrounding countries, refugees and stuff start coming in from the other countries because they hear there's food in Egypt. And because of what Joseph has done with the power that he was given, not only are they able to feed their own Egyptian people, they're able to feed these other people from the surrounding countries as well. And in fact, one of the countries that the famine spreads to is Israel, where Joseph's family, including, if you know the whole story, it's his brothers that were going to kill him, but they threw him in a pit, and that's when the slave traders found him and started this whole sort of thing. They all live in Israel, and they're getting hungry. They come to Egypt, and when you follow the whole story through the end, they get reunited with Joseph, and there's even a reconciliation. At the end of it all, Joseph looks on this journey he's taken from where he got thrown in a pit and sold into slavery, and where he got thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit, and then he spent 2 years there, and then came to power over Egypt. And he looks at all of this and all that had happened, and in Genesis chapter 50, he concludes, and he's saying this to his families, particularly to his brothers that threw him in the pit that started all of this, where the slave traders found him. He says, "Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today." And so Joseph sees that through all of these bad things that happened, that God was working to do something good. And what is fascinating to me is to watch how Joseph changes through, this story's taken place over years, from where he gets thrown in the pit to where he's reunited with his family and they reconcile. This takes place over years, and we can kind of watch Joseph taking a spiritual journey or a spiritual growth kind of thing, and it's what looks to me like sort of a reverse power trip. And so I want to walk you through that real quickly and then move on to a second topic. But Joseph's spiritual growth, or his reverse power trip, starts out where Joseph does what's good for him. If you were here the very first week of this series, we looked at Joseph, and he discovers he has this ability to interpret dreams as visions of the future. And the first thing he does is he gets a vision that one day he's going to be really powerful. And the first thing he does is he starts telling everybody, including his siblings, hey, one day you're going to bow down to me. He uses it as a way to fuel his vanity and to ingratiate himself, not with his siblings who he tells this with, but he's kind of a favorite of his dad, and he just plays all of that up, and he showcases it, and he's in life for himself, and he does what's good for himself. Then he gets sold into slavery, and before he gets thrown into prison, he's serving as a slave in the house of one of the high officials of Egypt. And as Julie shared last week, the wife of the high official takes a liking to Joseph. And there's apparently some shift has taken place in his character, because this guy who was kind of feeding his ego, presumably this could have fed his ego, he starts doing not what's good for him or good for his ego, but just simply what is good. He starts discerning right from wrong, and that there is sort of a moral structure to the world, and he's wanting to find out what's right and wrong and do what's right. And so he refuses the advances of the official's wife, even though then she comes back and she accuses him of being the aggressor, and he gets thrown into prison. And in prison, where he could have just got this hard heart and got resentful and plotted his revenge or whatever else could have happened, he becomes a model prisoner, and he continues to do what's good. And then there's this third shift when he gets into the presence of real power with Pharaoh. He takes this power that Pharaoh gives him, and he uses his power for the good of others. So he goes from doing what's good for him to what's just good to what is good for others. And it's a power trip. Just very unlike the kind of power trip that I've taken, or maybe you've seen other people taken, but it is very much like the power trip that Jesus lived and called his followers to live. In fact, there's a scene in the book of Mark where Jesus calls his disciples around him, and he says these words in Mark chapter 10. He says, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them. Their great ones are tyrants over them, but it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." In these words and in his life, Jesus is revealing that God's desire for everyone is to take a power trip. But it's a reverse power trip. It's about taking the power that we have and using it not for our own sakes, but for the sake of others. This is the kind of power trip that God hopes all of us as individuals and as a community will take. Now, in the story of Joseph, there's what I'm going to call power tools also. Now, I'm not talking about the power tools that some of you may think of on Father's Day, the kind you plug in and do stuff with. Great as those are, they didn't have electricity or power tools back in Joseph's day or in Jesus' day. But they did have tools of power, things that they could use. For Joseph, his power tool was food. It was the thing he had access to that he could use his power with for the good of others, and he put it to use for the good of others. All of us have access to those kinds of power tools. It may be something that we have in terms of resources or possessions. It may be gifts, or it may be talents, it may be interests, it may be skills, but we all have something that we have access to that can be that tool that we use on this reverse power trip that God wants to lead us on. And back in Joseph's day, his power tool was food. That is still an incredibly useful tool of the reverse power trip today. There's a guy down in Dallas named Chad Hauser who is a chef. His power tool is food. And I want to show you what he did with it on a reverse power trip in this video.
Welcome to Dine with Jim White. I love this place. You can get a great meal at one of the top restaurants in town and help a great cause. Cafe Momentum. Eat, drink, change lives.
Cafe Momentum is a restaurant that serves as a 12-month paid post-release internship for kids coming out of juvenile detention. They work their way through 5 stations in the restaurant, everything from washing dishes to waiting tables and everything else in between. We focus on social skill and life skill coaching and development. And we also employ an entire case management staff to be able to surround these kids with an ecosystem of tools and resources that they've lacked in their life to truly affect change. Each one of those stations allows for a certain very hands-on approach to learning certain life skills like organization, time management, and social skills like looking someone in the eye when you speak to them, disagreeing appropriately, accepting no. For our interns, our guests represent a group of people, a collection of people that don't come from their streets and don't look like them and don't behave like them. And for them to work in a dining room with those individuals and be treated as equals is a very powerful moment. It's important to us that we instill upon them the idea of gratitude. So we had every single one of our interns write something on a plate that they're thankful for. And that's the plates on the wall behind me. It's a collaborative art piece between ourselves and artist Shane Pennington called the I'm Thankful Plate Project. And we actually serve a dish at the restaurant on those plates. When the waiter takes the plate to a guest, it becomes a very symbolic reminder, not only to the intern to be thankful for this individual who's decided to spend their evening supporting us and them, but also to the guest to be thankful for this young man and young lady that has dedicated themselves to a better life and is seeking a path to become a better citizen.
Do you know anyone that's on a power trip? Chad Hauser's on a power trip. Joseph was on a power trip. God would like to take you and us as a community on a power trip. A reverse power trip from what most of the rest of the world does that moves increasingly towards using the power that we have for the sake and the good of others. Now, on this power trip, you may need some power tools. For Joseph, it was food. For Chad Hauser, it is food. Some of you have found the power tools of education and fluency in languages other than English to take a power trip down to our partner elementary school, Mark Twain, and to be in what is really ministry, but doing good for the sake of the students down there. God wants to take us on a power trip, and we each have tools that we can use on that trip.